season of Lent is an uncomfortable season of the year. It's an uncomfortable experience. It's a season that recognizes that life is a journey from dust to dust. Of understanding that we have all come from dust, and it's to dust that we will all return. All of us, should the Lord tarry, all of us will go down to the grave someday. But you know, if we aren't careful, deadness can creep into our souls long before our body is lowered into the ground. And so the season of Lent calls us to reflect on the condition of our souls, of looking for those dead spots in our souls and finding in God's grace forgiveness, healing, and wholeness. So that when we get to the great celebration of resurrection, that is Easter Day, we are ready to celebrate with gusto. Now, recently I read a book that's titled Into Thin Air. It tells the story of the author's experience during a tragic 1996 expedition on Mount Everest. Many people lost their lives when a rogue storm slammed into the mountain. And as I read through the book, it occurred to me how similar many of the experiences that were faced during that expedition are to the experiences that we all have in life. For although most of us will never know the sheer panic of being locked into a blizzard at 29,000 feet in the air, all of us will face times and know seasons of life in which the storms of life are raging. When we have to make a choice between freezing in fear, giving in to death, or stepping into faith and living fearlessly. You know, in the midst of our journey from dust to dust, we can often find ourselves in a position of feeling very much alone. We can find ourselves feeling very much like those stranded hikers on Mount Everest, wondering if God notices, wondering if we've been abandoned, left to figure things out on our own. The good news is that we're not the first ones to have these feelings and experience these struggles. In fact, the Bible is full of stories that demonstrate how, regardless of how fierce the storm may be, regardless of how much we may feel alone, we are never alone. And so through this series of Lent, what we're doing is exploring some of these stories from the Old Testament. Stories in which ordinary people like us, instead of becoming frozen by fear, giving in to death, chose to live fearlessly by stepping into faith. For example, last week, we talked about how there will be many times in life when we are in need of direction, when we're facing decisions and we're not sure which way to turn, when we need a guide who not only knows what lies in front of us, but is able to take us through the challenge and deliver us safely home. And in the story of Abram, we saw that faith trusts God to lead and gives us the will to follow. And so regardless of the unknown situation that we face, we need not recoil in fear. We need not give in to death. Instead, we can live fearlessly by stepping into faith, trusting God to lead, and choosing to follow. Now, another issue that we confront, whether we're climbing Mount Everest or whether we're just living life, is that there will be times in life in which we find ourselves desperate for basic essentials. On Everest, one of those essentials of life is oxygen. Though there have been some that have climbed Everest without breathing support, generally speaking, if you try it, you're going to die. Once you get above about 26,000 feet, your body desperately needs oxygen. And so if you try to summit Everest, you might get to the top, but you're not going to get back home again. You're going to die from something known as HAPE if you don't have the oxygen that you need. But you know, mountain climbing isn't the only experience in life that leaves us desperate for our next breath. When there's no help in sight. When we find ourselves wondering how our basic needs are going to be met. The foreman announces layoffs. The scholarship doesn't come through. The insurance company drops you. You discover a lump. The car breaks down and you don't have the finances to either fix it or replace it. You come home and find a Dear John letter on the counter. In these and in many other situations in life, we can find ourselves wondering where to turn to find the resources we need to survive. And in the book of Exodus, we come across an episode which teaches us to live fearlessly by placing our faith in God to supply, and gives us the will to seek His face in times of need. And so I invite you to listen as I read for you Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" You know, the first thing that catches my eye when I read this story is the fact that the people of Israel have a very real need. They have this need that must be met if they are to survive. Israel is on the way from Israel to the promised land, or from Egypt to the promised land. They are traveling from place to place as the Lord leads, is what the text tells us. And this is no small group of folks. Scholars aren't exactly sure, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million people. Though we're not exactly sure, we do know this, that the nation of Israel had grown so large that the Egyptians were worried that their slave Israelites were going to overthrow them. That's how big a group we're talking about. So the need for water is real, and the need for water is great. A trickling spring is not going to get it done for the Israelites and all their livestock. And at this location, there's no water at all. So the Israelites have a very real need. I don't want to downplay the significance of their need. If they don't have water, they're going to die. Having said that, I do need to recognize that at this point in the storyline of the relationship between Israel and God, grumbling about needs has become an all too familiar pattern. Exodus records that at least 4 different times in the course of 3 months, when Israel faces a need, instead of choosing to trust God and to seek His face, they go to grumbling, they go to complaining, and they attack the leader, Moses. Boy, isn't that how we are? When things aren't the way we want them, we go right after the people that we believe should fix it for us. They even go so far as to blame Moses for leading them out of Egypt in order to die in the desert. And each time, though Israel hasn't figured it out, Moses knows where to turn in times of need. Every time, Moses goes to the Lord, and each time, God responds by giving Moses specific instructions for action. Actions which will meet the people's needs not through Moses' strength, but through rather miraculous means. And so the underlying issue at play in the passage is not the fact that God is a stingy sovereign. It's not that God is unwilling to provide. It's not that God is unable to provide. It's not about God not being willing to be the supply. In fact, at no point in the story is God even characterized as being frustrated or irritated. Certainly not angry. He knows His people have a real need. He knows the significance of the crisis they're facing. And God is more than happy to provide the supply His people need. Now, the issue is not that God is a stingy sovereign. The issue at stake is that Israel keeps seeking the wrong source for the supply of their need. Based on their questions, it's pretty clear that the people are questioning whether God has abandoned them. If He's left Moses in charge to figure it out. And they're beginning to suspect that Moses, like Pharaoh, has some ulterior motives, that he's in it much more for his own glory and gain than the people's good. And perhaps that's why God's response to this present crisis is one that not only meets the present need, but also addresses this underlying issue of deep uncertainties in God's presence. Clearly, the power to produce water from a rock is not something Moses has. And the power to produce water from a rock is not something that's in his rod. Instead, the power resides in God's presence. Did you see? I will stand there by the rock. God promises His presence and His provision. Moses and the rod are merely instruments, representatives of God's presence, power, and provision. And so this story, so contentious in its details, ends up being a story of grace. A story of God graciously supplying the needs of His people as they look to Him and seek His face. You know, from this side of history, for those of us who are looking back on this story from the perspective of water coming as easily as turning a faucet, it can be easy for us to look down on the Israelites for their lack of faith. But if we'll just pause for a moment and look behind the details of the story, we'll discover that this This episode isn't just some old story about people who lived a long time ago that are very different than ourselves. Yes, it did happen a long time ago. But it teaches us some critical lessons about God, about ourselves, and about our relationship with God. For who of us has not found ourselves desperate for a drink? Desperate for a supply? Like an abandoned hiker on Everest, even desperate for that next breath, wondering where our needs will come from, wondering if God notices or if He's abandoned us to figure it out on our own. Oh, it's in those moments that this story from Exodus becomes so powerful. For it reminds us that God is present. It reminds us that God cares deeply about us, that He knows our needs and wants to meet our needs as we seek His face. This story about water from a rock teaches us that faith trusts God to supply and provides us the will to seek His face. Last year, right about this time, God was in the process of teaching me a huge lesson about this issue. That faith trusts God to supply and provides the will to seek His face. Last year at this time, my son Jim had been accepted to Huntington University. There was great excitement. By the way, if you have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren that are starting to look at college, I would encourage you to consider Huntington University. It's our college. It's our United Brethren school. And yes, it's a long way away. If you'd like to know, I'm going to leave right after church this morning. Jim's got to get back from spring break. And I've got meetings in Huntington tomorrow and Tuesday. So if you'd like to come along, I've got 2 seats in the back. Chris, you going to go? All right. Yeah. Jim desperately wanted to go to Huntington. He felt strongly that God was calling him to Huntington. And then we got the financial package. Many of you know what that's like. We crunched our numbers, and at the end of the day, he still needed $8,000 to pay for year 1. Janet and I, and probably especially I, desperately wanted to be the hero. We desperately wanted to provide for our son. But we couldn't. And to say that I was feeling like more than a bit of a failure last year right about this time is putting it as mildly as I know how to put it. To make a long story a little bit shorter, what God taught me through that whole experience is that although I had learned to trust God to supply, and I'd learned to seek His face to meet my needs, to meet Janet and my needs, I had not yet learned to trust God to supply as my sons sought His face. See, I wanted to be the vehicle through which God worked. And what God showed me is that it's no longer my job to be the supply. It's no longer my job to be the one my sons turn to seek Dad's face to meet their needs. It was time for my son to learn to seek God's face to meet the need and provide the supply. This year, I'd like to tell you that I've got it all figured out, that I'm as cool as the other side of the pillow. I'm not. I still really want to be the hero. Particularly since Jim is looking at year 2, and several $1,000s of the resources he had for year 1 have already been spent. And there's no replacement for them. I've got no idea how the money's going to happen. And I'd like to tell you that I don't want to be the guy to fix it. I do. But by God's grace, I'm at least at a little bit different point this year than I was last year. I'm at least not in a panic. I'm at least realizing the spiritual warfare that I'm in. And so now as Jim looks at year 2 and as David starts to look at year 1, I've at least taken 1 or 2 steps forward in this idea that faith trusts God to supply and provides the will to seek His face. Oh, my friends, God cares deeply about us. He desires to move us from a place of fear to a place of trust. God provides for us, and then He asks us to trust Him for the next big thing. And when He doesn't provide in exactly the same time and in the same way that we prefer, He calls us to trust Him. Trust Him to be our supply and to seek His face for our needs. So, brothers and sisters, as we journey through this season of Lent, as we journey through life from dust to dust, as we experience those seasons of need when it appears that there is no hope, when you find yourself having a need desperately, as desperate as the Israelites in the desert with no water, as desperate as an Everest climber with no oxygen. Oh, you may find yourself wondering if God notices. You may find yourself wondering if God cares. You may find yourself even wondering, has God abandoned me? But I can assure you, on the truth of God's word, and from the experience of my own example, that whatever need you're facing, God knows all about it. And although you may feel very much alone, you are not alone. God is present, and He has the ability and the desire to provide for you. In fact, God not only has the ability and the desire to provide for your basic needs, He wants to provide your deepest needs as well. One day Jesus met up with a woman who was drawing water from a well. He asked her for a drink of water. She was reluctant. And here's his response. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked Him, and He would have given you living water. Oh, my friends, God is not a stingy sovereign. God overflows with grace and desires to not only meet the practical needs of your body, but also the deeper needs of your soul. He can and He will provide. And so whatever your need today, instead of becoming frozen by fear, instead of giving in to the deadness that can strike our souls, I urge you to step fearlessly into faith, trusting God to supply and giving you the will to seek His face. We've scheduled this next song to give you time to reflect, because we know how busy life gets. So as our musicians come to the platform, and throughout this next song, I want to invite you to just spend some time in reflection, to consider the questions, what is God saying to me through His Word? What do I need to do about that? Maybe in the course of that reflection, you want to spend some time praying, whether it's there or here at the prayer rails. Maybe you want to just sit and listen to others sing. Maybe you want to jot some notes on your note sheet. There's a box on the back to provide space for that. Or maybe you want to sing. Whatever it is that God is calling you to do in response to His Word in this moment, I invite you to do so through the presence and power of the Holy Spirit.